The chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first add my words of welcome to those that you've already extended to Congresswoman Corrine Brown and to Dr. and Mrs. Danforth, who represent the Bimini project, the Bimini Bahamas plaque project for Martin Luther King Jr. We had a delightful evening with them last night in which the project was explained in some detail. And there's going to be a press announcement later this morning. But these are dear friends of the Bahamas, dear friends of Bimini, and of Ansel Saunders in particular. And it was very moving to hear the story told by Mrs. Danforth last night about how she first came to know of the experiences of Martin Luther King Jr. In Bimini as he prepared for his acceptance speech of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And later, Ansel Saunders also tells the story of taking him into the mangroves just shortly before his untimely death in 1968, when again in the mangroves he prepared for one of his final addresses in the United States, again I say before his untimely death. And so this is going to be marked suitably with a bust in the mangroves, and a celebration is planned for the weekend of the 5th of October, and it is hoped that the people of Bimini, people of the Bahamas generally, will join the entire delegation in Bimini for those observances. And we want to extend our thanks as a country to them for this, this great effort. And of course, it's always delightful to see Congresswoman Brown. She's a warrior from the old school, and we worked together quite closely during the time of the issues in Haiti in the early part of the century. So welcome, Congresswoman Brown. And it's only left for me to add that I hope to be in Bimini tomorrow myself for the second time. I'm actually going to run in the race. The 45th annual Glenda's Road Race is taking place tomorrow. It begins at 6 o'clock. It's an open. I'm going to bring back a gold medal. I promised the member for South Abaco that I would bring back my gold medal. So I intend to do that. I'm sorry? But this is a race started by the late Glenn Roll in honor of his daughter Glenda. And this is the 45th version of the race, and it's quite a community project. So we look forward to having a good time. And it's organized, and Mr. Leonard Stewart is here, who's also part of the Ministry of Tourism's team and is working with the Bimini Martin Luther King project. He's also here this morning. So I look forward to it and hope we have a lot of fun. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that. A real athlete like the member for Tall Pines. Mr. Speaker, may I also take this opportunity to invite members up to Fox Hill for the annual Fox Hill celebrations, which will take place in Fox Hill beginning at 11 a.m. on Tuesday. It will bring an end to the observances for Emancipation Day, the 178th anniversary of emancipation, and it begins with the Baptist church services at 11 a.m. Our Prime Minister will be joining us then and moving from the churches, beginning with St. Paul's, then to Macedonia, then to St. Mark's, and finally up to Mount Carey, and listen to the children perform their skits and their recitations. So it's an interesting day. Come watch people climb the greasy pole at around 6 p.m. Those of you who have never seen it, it's quite an exciting event. And the prize again this year is $1,000. So come join us, please, on Tuesday, the 14th of August, beginning at 11 o'clock for Fox Hill Day. And finally, just by way of of an introduction to say my condolences to the family of the late Sonny Waugh. I read this morning where he had passed away at the age of 84. He's a well-known Grand Bahamian and a well-known engineer and builder in our country. I graduated from St. Augustine's with one of his sons. He was a good friend, and he always had a kind word to say, but we will miss him, and so I'd like to offer my condolences on his passing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor and privilege this morning, just a few days or a couple of weeks after announcing in the House that we would be moving to amend the Immigration Act, to do so this morning with a bill to amend, a bill for an act to amend the Immigration Act 2012. The starting point is perhaps a philosophical one. The first time I heard the word morganatic was in connection with the former King of England, the Duke of Windsor, who served in the Bahamas as governor from 1940 to 1945, after having abdicated as the King of England. And those of us who know from our history the run-up to that story, he ran into problems with the British establishment because he wanted to marry, prior to his being crowned king, he wanted to marry a woman who was a divorcee. And the British establishment objected. And in the run-up to the negotiations, one of the things he tried to negotiate was a morganatic marriage, which would mean that he could be king, but his wife would not have the title of queen, so that they would be of unequal rank. And I say that as the starting point of the philosophy of this because my own thinking about the spousal permit, or the relationship which ought to obtain between spouses, a man and wife, is supposed to be that they are equal in all things. And I believe the personal law, as it affects couples around the world, largely reflects that fact, at least in Western democracies. In the old private international law, it used to be that women took their domicile from their husbands. And so wherever your husband's domicile was, the wife took the domicile. That has now changed in many Western countries. And I think the common law has even accommodated that, so it is possible for a woman to have her own domicile, even though she's married to a man. And so the personal law has, as the law has modernized, reflects the fact that in all things, man and wife ought to be equal. And so this amendment is designed to try and further reflect that fact. The spouse of a Bahamian should be able to have the same rank in the country as the husband or wife. And it is reflected somewhat in the Constitution because the Constitution permits at present a wife to apply upon being married to a Bahamian for citizenship of the Bahamas, and the law does not require that individual to revoke her citizenship upon being granted that citizenship. So the idea is that you get married to someone, they ought to have the right to be here, to have the same rights of a citizen, to be able to work and live in the Bahamas. And I think everybody accepts that as the fair and the right thing to do. But even though that is the constitutional position, the fact is that as the practice has evolved, citizenship has not been granted upon marriage to people who marry a Bahamian man and are non-nationals of the country. In fact, the practice has developed that first there is a permission to reside, then there may be a work permit, then there may be permanent residence, and then after a period, ultimately citizenship. But the philosophical position, I say, is that a wife and husband ought to have the same rank. And so that is the starting point, to me, for this amendment. And in the history of the spousal permit, which now is granted to the spouses of Bahamians, it was done to accommodate in law what was a practice, that is, of not granting citizenship at the start of a marriage, but to have some interim position which would allow the person to be able to live and work here without having to concern themselves about applying to immigration for permission. It seemed to me, as we were reviewing this matter and as we went through our own campaign, that there was an interim step that needed to be taken because of the application process becoming so long and sometimes tortuous to move from the present 5-year period to permanent residence with the right to work. Because what happens now is you get married, you apply for a spousal permit. The spousal permit lasts for 5 years. After that expires, it says you should apply 6 months before that period for permanent residence with the right to work. The last cabinet gave delegated authority to the minister to grant permanent residence with the right to work to the minister instead of it having to go to cabinet, at least as it relates to spouses. But these were the steps that were supposed to be taken. But inevitably, the applications would pile up, and not be dealt with on a timely basis, even though the spousal applications were granted by the minister, even though the permission for spouses was in fact delegated to the minister. There are piles and piles of applications that just could not be dealt with in a timely fashion. So the question then is, why, if someone is lawfully married to a Bahamian, why should that person, in a marriage which subsists, in a marriage which is where there is not a legal separation, why should that person have to keep coming back to the Department of Immigration for permission to live and work in the Bahamas? And we decided philosophically that what we ought to do is to provide the opportunity that once you are lawfully married, and once the marriage subsists, you are able to apply for a spousal permit, and that permit can last for an indefinite period. And the law is so written. So the effect of the amendment is to remove the present restriction of 5 years and permit the minister to grant a spousal permit for an indefinite period. And what I'd like to do is to just take you through Section 30, subsection 2 of the Act to say how it will read once it is amended. The bill is a short bill, and it says that in the operative part, which is Clause 2 of the bill, says that Section 30 of the Immigration Act is amended in subsection 2 by the deletion of the words at the end of the subsection which appear immediately after the word permit, and B, in subsection 3, the insertion at the end of the subsection after the word period of the words if any. And so the result would be that the Act will now read, notwithstanding subsection 1, where a person applies in the prescribed form for permission to remain in the Bahamas for the purpose of residing or engaging in gainful occupation, and that person, at the date of the application, is married to a citizen of the Bahamas, is not a citizen of the Bahamas or a permanent resident, and is not living apart from the other party to the marriage under a decree of a competent court or under a deed of separation, the board may, in its absolute discretion, grant a permit to that person in this act referred to as a resident spouse, permitting that resident spouse to remain in the Bahamas for the purpose of residing or engaging in gainful occupation for a period commencing on the date of the grant of the permit. Full stop. So, the first significant change I think that deals with, as I say, is to give the minister the permission, or the board the permission, to grant a permit to engage in gainful occupation or to reside if you are a resident spouse. The other important change is that persons, for example, now who are married for more than 5 years, let's say you live overseas and you're married to a non-national, and for 5 years you haven't come home, so the issue is not a live one. At present, if you've been married for more than 5 years, you're unable to apply for this resident spouse provision. So, because the time begins to run from the beginning of the marriage, this is now saying that time will begin to run from the time the permit is granted. So that's a significant change, and some people have found themselves running afoul of that. And the difficulty was the interim step was a general workers permit, which costs $1,000 and lasts for a year. And so you had this anomalous situation where husbands were having to have work permits for their wives, to get work permits for their wives for $1,000 at a time, because they weren't being granted a more general permission. So the idea is to eliminate, where possible, this interim step and this expense. The actual expense of a spousal permit is the $100 application fee and $250 for the actual permit itself. So Section 3 will now read, upon the subsection 3 of Section 30 will now read, upon the receipt of any direction given by the board pursuant to subsection 2 in respect of any resident spouse, the Director of Immigration, in accordance with those directions and the provisions of any regulations, shall grant a permit in accordance with the provisions of this Act and in the prescribed form to that resident spouse, permitting that resident spouse to remain in the Bahamas for the period, if any, specified in the permit for the purpose of residing or engaging in gainful occupation. So again, theoretically, it would be possible for the minister to apply a particular period, but the idea is to give an enabling power which allows an indefinite period. So that is the design of the legislation, the philosophy behind it, and the intent of the government is as I have just stated. If I may go back for a minute, Mr. Speaker, to the actual design of the Immigration Act itself, which was passed in 1967 and brought into force in that year. I'll just say a few points about that bill to amplify our understanding of how the immigration regime operates in our country. First of all, Section 5 of that Act establishes an immigration board. The Immigration Board is in fact the Cabinet, chaired by the Prime Minister. The Act establishes that the Prime Minister and other ministers are the Immigration Board. So that is established in Section 5. Section 6 gives the power of the Immigration Board, power to the Immigration Board to delegate authority to a particular minister. And that has been done by successive governments, so that various powers have in fact been delegated to the minister and the Minister for Immigration. And these include the routine granting of work permits, the spousal permit, and as I indicated, the last cabinet agreed to delegate the authority to the minister for the spouses of Bahamians to get permanent residence with the right to work. Section 18 deals with the powers of revocation. This is an extensive section, but hardly ever used, which indicates that the board has the power to revoke what it grants. Section 12 also is another section which indicates the powers of enforcement. And these powers of enforcement apply not only to immigration officers, but also, importantly, the reason why I raised Section 12, to police officers and customs officers. So police officers, customs officers have the same powers with regard to immigration matters as immigration officers do by virtue of Section 12. And then it's also important to note that the Royal Bahamas Defense Force has similar powers under their own legislation to deal with immigration infractions. Now, immigration is an interesting thing for this country, a small country that does not have the skills base to enable its own development without the importation of those skills from outside the country. In 1967, the regime that came into office then had a philosophy which it called Bahamianization. And the philosophy of Bahamianization was designed to empower the Bahamian people in the development and skills base of their own country. It was an aggressive policy. I think one of the more telling stories, perhaps you can ask the member for Tall Pines, when the late Carleton Francis was the minister responsible for immigration, how he operated that regime to ensure that Bahamians got their places, their proper places in the commercial businesses and operations of the Bahamas. And it was responsible, we believe, for the empowerment of the Bahamian middle class. A whole generation of people rose up to become the captains of the commanding heights of the Bahamian economy as a result of that policy. But the issue of immigration, as I say, is two diametrically opposed objectives. And the question is, where does the balance fall? I'm awaiting a policy paper just for the purposes of reading and sharing with my colleagues from Bermuda that faces the same issue. And of course, coincidentally, the PLP is in power in Bermuda as well. But the minister there, in speaking to the House, said that on the one hand, you want to protect the labor force of the country, but on the other hand, you want to allow the skills which are necessary for the development of the country, which are not available in the country. And how do you meet that balance? I am now learning this job, having been in foreign affairs before, so I'm now learning the job of immigration minister, and it interested me to find out that this is largely a processing ministry. And I mean by that a ministry which takes in applications, and decisions have to be made on a rapid and sustained basis. And it is also interesting to see how, and to learn how, on the one hand, on the macro level, Bahamians are for Bahamianization, but on the micro level, Bahamians are interested in getting a work permit for the person to work for them. And so, again, the balance has to be struck between these two competing dynamics. One decision that we made, Mr. Speaker, had to do with the question of non-national fishermen coming into the Bahamas. There was a public statement made recently by the owner of a fishing operation called Geneva Brass. And he decried a decision made by the Department of Immigration with regard to the grant or the refusal of work permits for Dominican mechanics and engineers. I put those in quotes, mechanics and engineers, to work on his vessels. The run-up to the campaign saw us in the islands listening to fishermen in the Bahamas complaining about unfair competition from poachers from the Dominican Republic. In the spring of this year, the previous cabinet made a decision that a delegation should go to the Dominican Republic to speak to the government of the Dominican Republic with regard to this. And no doubt that aggressive measures were going to be taken by the government of the Bahamas to deal with this matter. Upon us coming to office, this cabinet made a decision to, and you heard the Prime Minister actually say it on his feet here in the Bahamas, that this was a matter of priority to put a stop to this. The poaching from Dominican fishermen, and also, as an adjunct to that, what appears to be a ruse that is being used by some people to get work permits for non-nationals under one guise, when in fact they're doing something else on the vessel. The decision was therefore made against that backdrop and the complaints from our fishermen to refuse these work permits. The owner of the operation has complained, and he came to see me. I indicated to him that I was constrained. Remember, this is why I gave the regime of the act. The board, the Immigration Board, is in fact the cabinet. And this decision was taken at a cabinet level. So a minister who has delegated authority has no authority to overturn that without an appeal to the cabinet. And what I said to the gentleman is I was prepared, since he had come and he made a case. And his case is that he cannot depend, and I don't adopt the case, I'm saying his case, because it's been in the public domain. He said that he cannot depend on Bahamians to work on his vessels and for his business to successfully, to be successful. In fact, he indicated that as a result of the refusal, Bahamians were hired to take his vessel, and they ran the vessel aground. Nevertheless, we are bound, if someone makes, by any citizen, if he makes an application, we are bound to present his application, and in due course, it will be kicked upstairs for consideration. But I just want to say generally to the fishing community that the government understands and hears quite clearly on these matters and is taking all the steps it can in order to address this issue. But we are constrained by the directions of the cabinet that no work permits are to be issued in these circumstances to individuals on these particular fishing vessels. And that will remain the situation until we are otherwise directed. I would also like to add that I am concerned in the immigration field again about the casualness with which people approach the issue of documentation and the value of their citizenship, and even the respect for the enforcement procedures of immigration. The other day I had the experience in a constituency clinic of a man who came to see me who is not a national of the Bahamas. who had a letter from the Department of Immigration which was issued in October of 2010. He presents the letter to me, and the letter says, your application for a work permit has been refused. You are given 21 days to wind up your affairs in the Bahamas. Yours sincerely. I asked him, what then is your status in the Bahamas? At which point, he pretended that he could no longer understand English. I said, what I'm asking you is, do you have a work permit? The answer is no. And I said, this is now 2012. A letter is issued in 2010. And you're sitting before the immigration minister now without status in the country. So what I ought to be doing is calling the police. We may need reinforcements. But I say this in a jocular fashion, but the more serious point is that there's this idea of immigration permission in the Bahamas is just too casually dealt with. And what I've asked the Department of Immigration to do is to try, in conjunction with the government's information dissemination apparatus, to design some program of public education on the need for people to have proper documentation. And this bleeds into when we come to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The casualness with which people lose their passports, 2, 3, 4 times coming back asking because they lost their passport. And this passport is the thing that indicates to you, for most people, or a voter's card, indicates that you're a citizen of the Bahamas and you have the right to reside here. And I say this becomes important because if we are going to do the things which are necessary to protect the Bahamas and what we have, immigration enforcement is key to that. And all Bahamian citizens should want to be involved in ensuring that those who are responsible, those who have the right to be in the Bahamas, are properly documented in here. Because the lack of the presence of undocumented non-nationals is a security problem, is a national security threat. And I would wish the Department of Immigration to be involved in the coming months, first in a program of public education, but in stricter enforcement procedures with regard to this. And I'm not one for, on these matters, the press has asked me about this before, about high-profile raids and grabbing people off the streets and buses and so on and so forth. What I would wish is because, number one, Mr. Speaker, Bahamians can't keep it up. I mean, you can only do these high-profile things for about 6 weeks before you run out of breath. So the main thing you have to do, is to put in place just a disciplined, regular regime of enforcement. And if you do that, and if the people of the country actually discipline themselves, then and not support it, then I think this problem will become an easier one to deal with. And so that's one of the messages I'd like to get out, that is coming. And that's my view. There's not going to be any high-profile publicity, public relations about it, but I think you will slowly see a ramping up of the enforcement measures on this issue, because it seems to me it's important for the country. And along with that is, as I said, the Ministry of Immigration is a processing ministry. I look at the number of applications for gardeners, handymen, domestics, and I say to myself, here I am, sitting in the seat of Loftus Roca now, granting permits for gardeners, domestics, and handymen. And I say, what is wrong with that picture? And to me, something is wrong with that. But it's beyond me to resolve or to solve. I merely point it out as an issue. But we have to, it seems to me that with unemployment being what it is, the answer from the public officials on this, Mr. Speaker, is that Bahamians will not do this work for the price which is being offered. So the result is we are constrained to do what we're doing. And I suppose it's a similar argument being advanced by the owner of Geneva Brass, that Bahamians can't, in his view, cannot perform. And the other thing I would say is what the Department of Immigration reports is that people have been using the ruse, I say, of applying for engineers and mechanics, but they're actually fishermen, not engineers or mechanics. And our law says that fishing is to be reserved for Bahamians. We have, Mr. Speaker, certain obligations under our free trade agreements, which require a certain approach to the granting of work permits at various levels. And there are issues of reciprocity in these trade agreements which make the job of this balancing act that much more difficult. It's always fascinating to me that the Minister of Immigration can't act on his own because the Minister of Trade is always over his shoulder saying, but you know, but you know. But that's the world in which we live. And we have to make sure that there's a balance in the way we perform our obligations. And in this connection, the question that I keep asking myself, and I'll repeat this, because something I said earlier, that the problem most people seem to identify with immigration is the migrant laborer who's coming to occupy the lower rungs of the economy in the Bahamas, to do the grunt work, so to speak, who the migrant who gets on the ship on the north of Haiti and makes the 8-day journey by sailboat up here to South Beach. And people focus on that, and that's an identifiable group. And even though it costs us $1 million a year to cope with that in terms of repatriations, you can identify that group, and you could deal with that. The more insidious problem, Mr. Speaker, is the question of the professional workforce, and in particular in the financial services sector, which has been so empowering and enriching for our Bahamian middle class. And what appears to be the view that in this new dispensation, world dispensation, that Bahamians must take second best in their country. And I keep saying to myself, particularly as regards the domestic banking sector, that as immigration minister, I'd be looking very carefully at what is happening to Bahamians in the domestic banking sector. And there are several of them that I'm looking at, but in particular, I've heard that Bahamians are blamed in one case for the explosion of credit which took place prior to this recession, and therefore didn't do the jobs effectively. And so essentially in that particular institution, all the Bahamians of senior ranks have been forced out and replaced by non-national talent. And there is no reason why, in my view, the talent is here. If you have appropriate training programs, you would be able to do this, to find the Bahamian talent. We did it before, we can do it again. I mean, you know, and I'm saying a man like Tony Allen, for example, got there because the Bahamas government took the position that that bank had to be Bahamianized. I mean, after all, that's why, you know, one of the early stories Sir Lyndon told about the late Sir Milo Butler taking him by the hand and confronting the establishment in the Royal Bank of Canada for Bahamians to get jobs in these banks. There is no reason in 2012 why the domestic banking sector should not be run by Bahamians. And so what we're trying to indicate, it's a job which is larger than all of it, than the Ministry of Immigration. But what we're trying to do is, both in the tourism sector and in the banking sector, to indicate that you have to identify understudies, and the understudies must be identified and trained as proper and appropriate replacements in these sectors so that they will eventually lead these sectors. It's our country, and it's no more, no less. And this also applies to our friends in the telecommunications sector. The Minister of Labor indicated, I think in another forum, that of the number of work permits that have been granted in that sector, and again, simply do not understand why this is necessary. It isn't. And it's not something that we believe should be supported. And so I just wanted to say those things by way of background and explain the position on this. The Immigration Act was amended on the 3rd of February 1997 to provide for these resident spouses under Section 29(3). And it entitles and permits foreign spouses of Bahamian citizens to apply if married for less than 5 years. So I've said already that what this is designed to do is that requirement will fall away, so that whenever you come to the Bahamas, at whatever point there is in your marriage, if you wish to opt for a spousal permit, that will be available to you. And it's not something that you have to keep running back to the Department of Immigration for permission for. And I want to raise this because in the feedback which came from this, there was a lot of discussion about the so-called marriages of convenience. That, and it's usually argued this way, that our women in the country, the foreign men are going to come in from the outside, marry our women, and then use them to get this status, and then dump them on the side. I mean, that's the crux of the argument. And I suppose there might be some of that, but the fact is a spousal permit only exists so long as the marriage subsists and so long as there is not a deed of legal separation. So if there is no marriage, the spousal permit falls away. Unlike permanent residence with the right to work, or citizenship, which you have a constitutional entitlement to. Those, well, I mean, Section 18 allows for revocation, but I don't think we know of any case where someone's permanent residence with the right to work has actually been revoked. This is a status which applies only to spouses, and a distinction is to be made between permanent residence with the right to work, which is hardly ever revoked, or citizenship, which I think is never revoked, because in most cases it used, well, not in the case of female spouses, leaves the person stateless. Now, Article 5.1 of the Bahamas Constitution says, is the section which gives the woman a right after the 9th of July, 1973, who becomes a citizen of the Bahamas by virtue of Article 3 of the Constitution. And if that person dies before the 10th of July, 1973, would have become, allows that person to apply for citizenship upon taking the oath of allegiance. Many people do not know this, who are married actually to non-national women, that their wives do not have to renounce their citizenship, so that they can continue to have their citizenship of origin, even as they get citizenship of the Bahamas. Those who, permanent residents with the right to work. Right, and I'm going to come to that too. My colleague was reminding me the result of that is men are discriminated against in that regard. And so one of the aspects of the Constitution that's being looked at with the amendment is that it will equalize the rights of men in that regard as it now obtains for women. And Article 10 deals with of the Constitution deals with the situation where people who are married after the 9th of July, 1973. And so the hope is that in passing this act, we will remove what is a nuisance, an irritant to many, many Bahamian citizens. And we hope that the processing will move along in a smooth fashion, and that people who come and apply to the Department of Immigration, we hope, certainly I haven't heard any complaints, are treated with respect, humanely, and decorum in the service that is being offered by the Department. I believe the matter was discussed amply in our parliamentary caucus with regard to the criticism of, or the bit about the danger of marriages of convenience and the abuse of the status. But in the main, we're satisfied that there are the appropriate safeguards in the legislation and by policy to deal with this. None of the application procedures are, there's no plan to vary those procedures. Each couple has to come in, there has to be an interview, it has to be a marriage which subsists. And immigration is trained in the interview techniques. As we said in another forum yesterday, the minister is not required with a microscope to go and inspect the sheets. A marriage it's done by public officials with an appropriate, proper, and humane interview. And it's determined that the marriage exists. And so long as the marriage subsists and exists, and there is no legal separation or divorce, then we believe it is appropriate for a spousal permit to be granted for an indefinite period. I hope that provides some background to this, amplifies some of the information about immigration matters, and I would be pleased at the wind-up of the debate to answer any issues which arise in the context of the interventions of members. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.